You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Simon Parker, and today I'll be hosting a discussion talking about so-called legal highs and their prevalence. Over the course of the last few years, there has been a sharp increase in the production and use of these products, both in the UK and around the world. In most cases, these come in the form of white powders or pills with a range of complicated chemical structures, or strains of new synthetic cannabis. Products that can be brought freely over the counter at specialist shops or over the internet, and in many cases either mimic or give similar effects to drugs that are illegal. In its recently published annual report, the European Union's Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction found that more and more people are choosing to use so-called legal highs, while drugs that have been used for longer periods like cocaine and heroin are being used less. The EU report found there are now more than 280 new drugs in circulation, with 73 appearing in the last year alone. Recent figures published in Britain also show a worrying rise in the deaths caused by these drugs. In 2011, 41 people died because of them, compared to 9 deaths in 2007. Today we'll be discussing the prevalence of these new drugs in the UK and around the world. To discuss these subjects, I'm joined by Mark Dempster, a former drug addict and now a drug councillor at the Harley Street Clinic. Peter Reynolds, the leader of the political party Cannabis Law Reform, author and broadcaster Maryon Stewart, who founded the Angelus Foundation following the death of her 21-year-old daughter, who died after taking the drug GBL, and Michael Evans-Brown, a scientific analyst who studies the use of new drugs and was part of the team of scientists that compiled the EU's recent report into drug use. Michael Evans-Brown, you've been studying drug use and trends surrounding the use of drugs for many years. How popular are these new drugs and how prominent is their use?
I think that's one of the most important sort of issues where there's actually not very good data at the moment in terms of the prevalence of use of many of these new drugs. That's in part because the fact is that they've emerged so quickly, and the fact that often their use is limited to sort of specific groups such as people going to nightclubs and so on. But some of these drugs, and methadone is a good example in some countries, do sort of emerge into the sort of broader population. And when that does happen, then these drugs may be included in general population surveys in order to get a better sort of measure of the levels of use in the population as a whole. And as I've said, methadone is a good example of that.
Michael, are the users of these drugs confined to a traditional stereotype, a traditional club scene, or are there a range of people using them?
I think, at least sort of historically, many of the groups that have been studied are the ones that, for example, the Mixmag survey that looks at people who are dance music fans and so on. But what we're also seeing is that it's not just these groups who are using these substances. So, for example, some of the new drugs that we're detecting are being used for people going to the gym. So good examples of that are DMAA, which is a stimulant that's used as a pre-workout sort of stimulant. Other drugs such as Phenibut, which is an anxiolytic that's being sold as a food supplement. And this is a medicine that's authorized in Russia that's been in use, clinical use since the 1960s. So a range of sort of groups. It's not just sort of users who are going to nightclubs who are using these substances, although they are one of the main groups as a whole. But in relation to things like the synthetic cannabinoids, we know that in some European countries, individuals are using these in order to avoid drug testing. So, for example, in relation to drug driving and so on. So it's quite a broad group sort of overall.
Mark Dempster, you used illegal drugs for many years and now you work with people who have addictions to illegal drugs and legal drugs. How do the effects of illegal drugs and legal drugs differ and contrast?
I think they're probably quite similar. I mean, I've been in recovery now for 16 and a half years, so in that time I've not used any of the new drug trends. But what I gather from some of my clients that come through my practice, and also people that I meet in recovery forums, is they're very similar. It's a very similar makeup. Most of especially the cannabinoids, it's a very similar makeup to the herb itself or the plant itself. So I think the scientists who are producing, the organised crime syndicates really that are producing a lot of these drugs are so effective in their manipulation of certain compounds to have a really effective product. Of course, the drug using trends have changed significantly in the last 20 years. Historically, we had in this country, 20 years, 25 years ago, it was mostly clients that would present to treatment services would be mostly opiate or benzodiazepine sort of users, some cocaine users, maybe some freebase, but very few and far between. And then, of course, later on, a little bit later, we had a lot more crack cocaine coming in. When crack, previous to that, we had freebase, people who wanted to use cocaine in that way or to smoke it, they would freebase.
Have you noticed a increase in the amount of people experiencing serious addictions to these drugs?
Yeah, I've noticed in my Harley Street practice more clients coming in that are presenting, that are using, that are getting... See, the difficulty is it's with the new drug trends is the accessibility, and also because it's not illegal, they can immediately reassure themselves that it's not, they can normalise it more to themselves, that it's not illegal, they're not doing anything wrong, it's accessible, it's cheap. A lot of these drugs are very, very cheap. And what is interesting is some of the guys that come in to see me are professionals who are in very good professions in London, who are using these drugs but are actually selling some of these drugs. Because it's not illegal, it's more profitable to buy it in bulk. So they buy it in bulk and they give it to their friends. They're not selling it like going out and finding markets, but they're selling it on. There's definitely been an increase. In the last 2 years, I've seen, a significant increase.
Can I come in there?
Yeah, of course, Maryon Stewart.
Our experience is that legal highs are completely different to conventional drugs, especially as far as young people are concerned. We've been going into schools and we developed a series of films to raise awareness, but in the process of doing that, we were asking kids to help evaluate the films. And so we did a before and after questionnaire, and we found now, we've done about 800 kids, we found that about over 2/3 of them think that legal highs are safe and fun, and they say they're freely available and that their friends are using them and that they've tried them and so on. When they see the film, we've made a film now called Not What It Says on the Tin, which is a 6-minute film, and then they fill in the other part of the questionnaire. Over 3/4 of them say they feel angry, incensed or duped, and they feel that seeing the film has really brought home to them the fact that this is not what it says on the tin, and that it has actually changed their views about trying them. And I think that what you're looking at is a huge group of people who are being misled somehow. And these substances don't come under any labelling laws. They seem to circumvent every rule going, and it's become a worldwide epidemic. And the problem with them is that very often they are a combination of Class B drugs and toxic chemicals. And it's a complete hodgepodge. You don't know what you're going to get. So you're actually playing Russian roulette with your life unwittingly. And the problem is, not all kids die, but a lot of people are harmed for life. They can become psychotic. There's been an increase in hangings. Kids get admitted to hospital. They have to be tied down for 3 days because they're some of them get sectioned in mental hospitals. And just because they're going out thinking they're going to have a night's fun with something that's safe. I mean, till a few weeks ago, they were available on Amazon. Yeah. I mean, we got Amazon to take them down. But I mean, what does that do to a young person? It just serves to push home the point that these things must be safe because they're available through outlets like Amazon.
Peter Reynolds, you are the party leader of the political party Cannabis Law Reform. What's your reaction to what Maryon said there? Do you think enough is known about these things? Do you think people are educated enough?
No, not at all. I mean, coming at it from the political policy point of view, there are some very welcome signs that drug policies are developing and becoming more evidence-based and more rational than they are at the moment. But what legal highs demonstrates, what the whole phenomenon of legal highs demonstrates, is that if there's any purpose behind drugs policy, it must be to reduce harm. And what legal highs demonstrates is that, in fact, drugs policy, as it is in the Western world at the moment, actually increases harm. Because the legal highs are the product of prohibition. They would not exist were it not for the fact that substances like cannabis and MDMA are prohibited. Now, we have over 5,000 years' experience of cannabis, and cannabis is a relatively safe substance. It's certainly considerably safer than alcohol and considerably safer than tobacco. We actually run a campaign for real cannabis, because real cannabis is much, much safer than what is being called synthetic cannabis. And let me just clarify that position as well, because synthetic cannabis is a misnomer. It's not what it is. The correct term for them are synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, and they're chemicals that bind to the CB1 and CB2 receptors. They bind much more tightly, much more strongly, and therefore sometimes produce a much stronger effect and a much longer lasting effect. But they're not synthetic cannabis because what they seek to do is to mimic the effects of just one cannabinoid, THC. And cannabis contains over 400 ingredients, 100 cannabinoids, many terpenoids, flavonoids, and other things which combine together to give an overall effect, which for most people, and I'm talking about adults here, children should not use drugs of any sort at all, but for most people, cannabis is a very safe substance. In fact, for most people, cannabis is a substance that does them good.
Why is it then that more and more people are turning to these legal alternatives? Is it because of the very strong branding which Maryon has talked about?
The idea, first of all, that they're legal, in actual fact, as Maryon correctly states, a lot of them aren't legal. A lot of them are combinations of substances that are now banned. But the worst thing we can do with any of these substances is to ban them. Okay, because prohibition always causes more harm than it prevents. We know that from experience. We know that from alcohol prohibition in the States. If you ban something, it creates a criminal market, and that's what's happened here. We've banned cannabis and MDMA, for instance, a lot of other drugs as well, of course. But we banned those. So what happens is criminals become involved because the profit potential is high. They're then prepared to use violence, human trafficking, all sorts of other techniques in order to circumvent the law. And what's now happening is they're using technology and science to develop new substances to get around the law, and that is all the product of prohibition. The reason this happens is because we have this absurd, irrational policy that we know doesn't work, and yet we keep on doing the same thing over and over again.
Maryon Stewart, I know you've got a very personal connection with this subject. What would you like to say?
There are hundreds of these things, as you say, and they're coming onto the market at a rate of 1 or 2 a week. And when they come on, they are legal. And the whole point is that because they're legal, people think they're safe. And it's just that's the thing that needs to be corrected. I mean, I think the New Zealand government have got the right idea that they've made a new law where they're actually putting the onus on the dealers and the sellers to prove that they're safe for human consumption before they can come to the marketplace. And that happens in every other aspect of our lives, whether it's a drug or toothpaste. You can't just put something on the market and let people take it, especially vulnerable young people.
Mark Dempster, what's your reaction on that?
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with Maryon as far as, for young people it's so dangerous, because I guess what's happening, especially in schools and universities around the world, really, is that the information gets cascaded down from other students or from other young people that, I've tried this, and of course I opened up a site just the other day to have a look, and it was Vanilla Sky, and I thought, my God, it's so bath salts, it was so accessible, and you just order online, and of course what happens with this is that, word spreads that, I've got this new drug, it's really good, and then somebody else tries it. But I'm just interested, Peter, about prohibition as far as, would you then think about legalising all drugs? I mean, you mentioned ecstasy and you mentioned cannabis, of course, but what about drugs like, illicit drugs that are Class A drugs, and knowing also there's a percentage of people that have addictive personalities that cannabis or these legal highs can be gateway drugs for them to move forward onto?
I would legally regulate all drugs. And I would say that, in fact, the more harmful and the more addictive a drug is, the more important it is that it should be legally regulated. The fact we have 300,000 problematic drug users in Britain, which mainly means opiates and crack cocaine.
Yeah, sure.
And those people are responsible for 70% of all acquisitive crime in this country because they need to get hold of their drugs. They do. It's a need because they're addicted to them. And what we need to do is take the market for all drugs out of the hands of criminals, deal with it responsibly, regulate it, and make sure, and people who are addicted to opiates or crack cocaine, they need to have it made available to them in a clean and safe form on reducing doses, which can enable them to solve their problem. But what we need to be very clear about here is that the people who are responsible for this, the people who are causing our children to take these dangerous substances, are the people who run our drugs policy. They're the people who are responsible for it.
Michael Evans-Brown, you've you've been studying in particular the European Union, but Maryon has mentioned the example of New Zealand. Are there any lessons that can be learnt from overseas, from other parts of Europe and around the world?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to recognise in the case of New Zealand that this is actually currently at the bill stage, so it's not actually been enacted, and so we'll have to wait and see through what happens to this bill as it's shaped through the Parliament and so on in that respect. And I know that there's obviously many eyes around the world on this approach that New Zealand are planning to take. I think it's also important to note that they are talking about, I understand it, a regulatory system that will only allow low-risk substances onto the market. And I think one of the difficulties will be in terms of actually defining sort of what is a low risk, given that obviously some controlled drugs such as cannabis are currently regarded as a sort of medium risk in some controlled drug legislation and so on. We also sort of need to sort of realise that, whilst I agree that, many of these new drugs are intended to sort of mimic the effects of controlled drugs, it's not always the case. Some of these new drugs are there to being sold as, or marketed, let's say, as having sort of novel effects. And MDMA, obviously, when it emerged in the late 60s and 70s and sort of really sort of took off in the United States in the sort of early to mid 1980s, obviously was at that stage sort of a novel drug. It wasn't controlled and sort of emerged there because people enjoyed the subjective effects that the MDMA sort of produced. But, these countries in Europe are, responding to this issue to see, what they can do to reduce the availability of these drugs and reduce the harms that some of them sort of pose. And, I mean, the issue about sort of being raised about the synthetic cannabinoids is, whilst often people will say that they mimic the effects of cannabis, I think it's kind of naive of us to sort of say that is the case. I mean, what we're seeing in terms of case reports linked to the use of the synthetic cannabinoids, we're seeing things like seizures and comas, loss of consciousness with some of these synthetic cannabinoids, which you simply don't see, with cannabis. So it's obviously sort of concern in that respect. We're also monitoring a range of other substances, highly potent substances that have started to emerge. So things like opioids and compounds called the MBOME compounds as well. So,
can I just come back in, because I just think there's one thing being heavily overlooked here, and that is the Angelus Advisory Board has over 26 world-class experts, and they all agree that banning is a waste of time and that raising awareness is the most important thing. And it has been demonstrated that if you do raise awareness, kids very often change their viewpoints. Obviously, there'll be people with addictive personalities who will be risk takers anyway, but there's a huge group of young people that are peer-led. The point is that there are no education programs for kids in schools. There's no national campaigns for them out of school. We did a big poster campaign around the country at the end of last year so that we could have a national awareness campaign, but we don't have the resources to keep that going. The government doesn't seem to be interested in taking that up, and I don't know any governments around the world that are doing that, and I just wonder why? Why not?
It's because they're terrified of the media. They're terrified of the media, and they're terrified of the other major factor in this, which is the alcohol industry, because the alcohol industry is violently against the legalisation of any substance which might be regarded as a competitor.
But the mission statement of the Home Office is to protect the people and young people.
But they do exactly the opposite. I mean, this is what I said earlier. You're never going to eliminate these harms because people have the desire to get high. It's a perfectly natural human desire. But you're never going to eliminate it. But the way to solve this problem, as far as we can solve it, is to legally regulate cannabis and MDMA. And if you do that, if you did that tomorrow and make them available to adults only, in Holland, if you want to go and take an E in a nightclub, you can go and get it analysed in the nightclub.
But we're talking about hundreds of legal highs here, not just cannabis. The point is, these legal highs, we are misleading young people.
We are.
And they think they're safe because they're legal. This is nothing to do with name drugs where people know what they're getting. This is not what it says on the tin, and we're allowing people to be misled.
All we ever tell people about drugs is untrue. I mean, the government constantly comes out with this idea we mustn't send the wrong message. The only message that government consistently sends to people about drugs is they don't tell them the truth.
Mark, you work as a drugs counsellor who works very closely with people who are using these drugs.
Yeah.
How do you react to what Peter said?
Peter's got an interesting point. I think from the beginning when he says that 80% or 76% of the crime that's committed, acquisitive crime, is drug related, there's lots of there's pros and cons for legalisation, and I do notice that to emphasise what Maryon said, there has to be more money spent on education for young people and for adults as well around drugs as a total. The only thing that we've got in this country at the moment is the Amy Winehouse Foundation are currently providing education in school, but there's very limited there seems to be very limited funding, and of course what happens is as young people just follow the nose of other young people, and they just decide, okay, if they're doing that, so I'll follow suit. As far as working with clients, I work with clients to look at the underlying reasons why somebody uses the chemical, and this is what you've always got to. The people that present at my door are people who they don't use drugs recreationally. They get to a point in their life and it doesn't matter what the profession is, or whether it's somebody in a park bench or somebody who's a millionaire. They get to a point where they've got a serious addiction problem, and you have to then look at the underlying reasons why they use drugs in that particular way. And it's always low self-esteem. It's an oversensitivity, and of course the latest neuroscience that's coming out is saying that 10% of people have got a lack of serotonin, that's a lack of dopamine. They've got impulse control that's compromised, and the way they deal with stress is limited as well. So whether it's legal or not, whether we legalise or we don't legalise, I think the issue is more so that providing people with much information and choice around what it is that they're going to pursue.
We've been speaking very specifically about what's going on in the UK, but obviously a lot of these substances are being brought into the UK by very legal means. It appears. I mean, we've spoken about what the government could do or what legislation could do in the UK, but what's being done in places like China and India where these drugs are being created?
Well, I don't think we've got any hope of doing anything about that at all. I think we just have to deal with the reality of the fact that, I mean, I've seen them. I've seen, a thing that looks like a tea caddy covered in Chinese writing arriving in this country full of a white powder, which is a synthetic cannabinoid. I've seen it being mixed by a distributor of these things where he uses an inert herbal substance and an inert substance that looks a bit like hash, and literally just pours it into a food mixer. No measuring or anything. Pours it into a food mixer, mixes it up, and then chops it up into little pieces and puts it in packets. It's appalling.
Michael Evans-Brown, you study the use of drugs all around Europe. Because these drugs and these substances are so new, from a medical perspective, surely doctors and physicians just surely don't know much about them. If you were to go into accident in emergency room with maybe an overdose of ketamine or cocaine, there may be procedures in place to deal with those structures, but obviously these are drugs which many people have never even heard of, even doctors. How are people in the medical trade and the medical profession dealing with these?
Well, I think you're absolutely right there. I think that in terms of knowledge about many of the new drugs, it's limited to relatively speaking, a small number of experts, and even there's often very little information, because we're talking about many new drugs. Basically, they've been taken from the scientific and patent literature, from legitimate sort of research, and also legitimate sort of research into studying the body, as well as sort of potential sort of medicine. So individuals are basically searching through this literature and identifying substances that obviously have sort of psychoactive effects. But this literature, this sort of legitimate literature, often contains very little information. So it may have some information about the chemistry, how to synthesize, and some perhaps sort of basic data that's been conducted either in sort of cell studies or in animal studies, but often there's not even that sort of information. And obviously, individuals who are taking some of these new drugs then end up obviously experiencing adverse effects. So it's there that sort of early warning systems, sort of at the national level and at the European level, can sort of play a key role, particularly things like poisons information services and so on that can rapidly sort of distribute information when a new substance emerges, not just in terms of its sort of chemical profile, but also some of the harms that may be experienced based on analogy to other substances, but also from reports from patients who are presenting to hospitals and so on. But you're absolutely right. I mean, for the most part, there's very little information, and then it's often if a substance sort of diffuses further into
put a website together called whynotfindout.org, which got launched in October, and it's the first resource for young people, or the first resource dedicated to legal highs, and we try and keep it absolutely up to date with all the new substances. But, I mean, this has reached an epidemic. I mean, even in America, President Obama announced that it had reached an epidemic. There were 82 new substances there last year. I think these crazy chemists have outsmarted legislators and educators all around the world, and we have to do something serious about it to actually get the ground back and keep young people safe.
A final quick question. Mark Dempster, you used drugs for a very long time. You still work with people who do use drugs. Does this all boil down to what Peter's actually said previously, is that however you choose to look at it, people will always find ways and loopholes to not feel normal? If they've done that for thousands of years, and be those legal drugs or illegal drugs, be that alcohol, tobacco, sugar, heroin, people will always attempt to feel different to how they normally feel.
Yeah, I think there's a percentage within society that have an addictive personality, that have a predisposition to drugs. They don't have an on-off switch, basically, and they start to use drugs and it progresses and it escalates. And I think there's a whole other batch of people that can use drugs recreationally. But I think also what we've got also in this country, that there are treatment systems to help people with substance misuse it's been set up for 20 or 25 years, where they work in a way that is not as effective as it could be. And I mean by that is when people sell drugs, when you go into a drug service and you ask for help, they might say, "I'll come back in a week and we'll give you an assessment." Whereas a drug dealer, if you phone a drug dealer today, the drug dealer says to you, "I'll meet you in Tesco's car park in 20 minutes. The drug dealer doesn't ask you to come back in a week, and this is where we have a problem, is that the system that's in place is not as effective. And these chemists throughout the world, these new chemists, the organised crime, they're producing new drugs at a rate of knots that they're 1 step or 5 steps ahead of all the authorities, and they will continue. This will continue that way as long as we have this situation.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my guest, Mark Dempster, a former drug addict and now a drug councillor at the Harley Street Clinic; Peter Reynolds, the leader of the political party Cannabis Law Reform; author and broadcaster Maryon Stewart, who founded the Angelus Foundation following the death of her 21-year-old daughter, who died after taking the drug GBL; and Michael Evans-Brown, a scientific analyst who studies the use of new drugs and was part of the team of scientists that compiled the EU's recent report into drug use. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Simon Parker, and today we're talking about legal highs and their prevalence. Joining me to discuss this subject is Mark Dempster, a recovering addict and an author; Peter Reynolds, the leader of the political party Cannabis Law Reform; author and broadcaster Maryon Stewart, who founded the Angelus Foundation following the death of her 21-year-old daughter, who died after taking the drug GBL; and Michael Evans-Brown, a scientific analyst who studies the use of new drugs.